Hi, everybody. As usual, we'll wait another minute to see if some people continue to wander in. As always, if you could register attendance in the meeting notes, which I just pasted in the chat, and which is also available at SLSA.dev/notes. And a reminder that we'll be following the SLSA's and Linux Foundation Code of Conduct during this meeting. Also, if you have any agenda items, please add it to the notes. Okay, why don't we get started? First, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome any new members. If you'd like to briefly say hi.
Hi, this is Malik here. I'm sorry, it's quite late here. I'm working out of India. I'm not switching on the video today, but next time I'll try to switch on my video. I generally have conflicting calls at this time, hence I'm unable to join this call. I'm a security architect in IBM, working on working as the control lead for vulnerability management for IBM Cloud. Currently focusing on bringing together all the standardization, but I was quite interested in working with this community as well to see what other latest happening here.
You're welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm John. I've been around a few of the other meetings. I have this first time I've made it to the specification call representing VMware, and I'm mostly just here because I miss Joshua and I wanted to see him. So,
Welcome. Anybody else? Okay, well, glad to see new faces. Certainly, you're very welcome, and thanks for joining. Today was the day we had planned on cutting release candidate 2. As I said last week, I think I said, I tagged things that I thought were blockers for V1. I didn't notice if anyone else added any more. But we have the following issues, which I could share the screen. So I guess before we get into that, I think assuming that we still want to cut the candidate today, which speak up if you disagree with that, that we could close, any pull requests that we could close today, any last minute fixes, especially those that would cause some sort of backwards compatibility problem, then send out a pull request today that would copy the directory, because again, we're using directory copies for our versioning, which hopefully will fix post 1.0, and simultaneously do a blog post and send out a mailing list announcement, which I'm hoping other people know more about, because I don't know the details of what's going on there. First of all, does that sound good? Any concerns or objections to that? Okay. As always, feel free to please interrupt. Okay, so I just want to quickly just look at the tagged V1 blockers. Let me share the screen. Okay. By the way, now when you present, I don't know if it was there before in Zoom, there's a little check mark that says share tab audio. And if you don't do that, then it doesn't take over your microphone. I feel like I'm still continually learning new things about Zoom, at least on Chrome, on my machine. Okay, so in terms, right now we have 6 open. I think there's 5 issues and 1 pull request maybe. I just filed this one today. Maybe let's talk about it in a minute. We have an issue, who sets expectations, for which there's an open pull request. I'd like to get that resolved and merged today, although I feel like that one we might want to continue iterating on. At least in my mind, it wasn't super obvious that like it just completely resolved the issue. There's a question about, should we add a new SLSA level distinct from builder ID? My feeling is, I didn't respond on the thread yet, that no, it is not a blocker for 1.0. And so instead of introducing a new thing last minute, we should just stick with what we have and then iterate on it in a future version. Which, if you disagree with, maybe I'll take just for simplicity, if you disagree with what I'm saying, either speak up now or comment on the thread. But otherwise, well, that's what we could do. This is, I think, a thing ongoing, a pull request ongoing. A what's new page we should have for the 1.0 release. We don't have it today. I don't think we should block the release candidate 2 on it. I'd rather just get that out the door and then work on that this week. Oh, this is a pull request around extensions, because it's changing the requirements around how we do extension fields. If you have any opinions on the schema of the format, if you could get that in, ideally for this pull request, that would be better than waiting. And then the last one is verifying artifacts, because right now it references levels, but doesn't say what those levels are, because it was copied from a different page. So I don't feel like any of those are hard blockers for doing the release candidate today. It seems more valuable to stick to a schedule and have a review period and fix it last couple issues. I see a couple heads nodding, so I guess that's useful. But if you disagree,
Yeah,
it would be useful to know.
I don't disagray. I think it's useful to agree like what changes are okay during a review period, which is one of the things you added to the agenda. Like I completely agree with all of your summary. Like verifying artifacts is a useful change. The provenance change seems fine to me. The expectation change, I think, seems reasonable to kind of continue to iterate on. After the RC, personally, I think that's probably okay, because we've tended to be quite flexible around clarifications, and agree that the SLSA level field shouldn't be a V1 blocker. That's that's like a recent enough and large enough change that I think we should kind of work on that after 1.0. So yeah, that was a long summary of agreeing with your statement.
I'm not sure so much about the who sets expectation and the provenance stuff. I mean, are we are we really sure? I mean, we can. Well, so first of all, we're not expecting to solve this today, are we? Or are you?
Personally, I think it's unlikely we'll be able to solve it today in a way that everyone finds satisfactory.
And then the question then becomes, are we confident this is not impacting, the spec in such a way that people will say, wait, you've changed the spec in more than an editorial way between this RC2 and the final publication. I am not, but Nicola has his hand up.
Yeah, just a comment. It was on verifying artifact. I agree with what you said to remove the must and the levels for now. It keeps things open, and we need to rework it after this release. But for the moment, it's better to remove all those must and levels. I think it's a good idea. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, coming back to Arnaud's comment with the who sets expectations. I agree with what you're saying, Arnaud. I don't know the answer to the questions, but I agree that we should figure out. So maybe we could talk about that for a minute. So the like the gist is that, let me try to recap the problem to see if people agree with that's the problem statement, because that's the first step. That like the whole concept of expectations is kind of confusing, and like who sets the expectations, as a producer or the consumer. And so Kara pointed out, like sometimes we use the word expectations to mean two slightly different things, kind of the actual expected values, but then things that a consumer uses to do a verification. So the proposal in the pull request was to have two different terms, expectations and verification policy. Whether or not this is the actual particular change, I think Arnaud's point is that if we change around these concepts now, that's more of just an editorial change, but rather like changing what the specification means. And so ideally before cutting the release candidate, and certainly before approving any changes, we should make sure that this doesn't significantly like change what the specification means. Is that right? Is that okay? Maybe that wasn't a very good recap, but is it correct at least?
I mean, that seems consistent with other open issues that got closed, where we're just using words that are overloaded and going through and picking new words so that it's more precise. So it's kind of in line with. I don't think, like, I guess we have to do a quick check to see if it changes anything, but I don't think if we stuck with those two and figured out which one it was in context, that's going to change anything about the spec.
I feel like a kind of a fundamental problem, which we've been discussing for months, is like when we look at this, like the verifying artifacts, like how does this fit into the specification? And that's actually maybe to Nicola's point. This was the issue that I opened today. Like, are these requirements or are these verification of the requirements? I know we talked about the conformance program of like how we certify a build system, but then is the checking of a policy or expectations like part of the specification, or is it verification of the specification? At least I personally haven't still not able to wrap my head around that.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
my thought is that we can't say what you're going to do with your verification. And so it's better that we're saying this is conformant to the specification, and then you can do additional actions based on that if you want to. But we shouldn't be dictating what people are doing. We should just be dictating, does this comply?
Well, the two are related, but like.
Oh yeah. I think that, right, like there's things that we can state is possible, like you can verify, like if the expectation here is you're this level of SLSA and blah, blah, and you're conformant, then you should be able to verify these things. And there's probably best practices that we can suggest, but different folks are going to come in with different sets of policies and needs and use cases. So yeah, that we also don't want to go and say you should be checking all of these things or none of these things. Yeah, I think that is very much based on the use case.
So, a couple of things. So first of all, I think, it's a spec and we're totally entitled to say, to be compliant, this is the things you need to do. But the thing is, we have different types of people who are going to try to, be compliant, conformant with the spec. We've said, of course, a big chunk is the build system implementers or providers, but we also have the consumer side. And this is the verifying artifacts section of the spec, to me is, addresses specifically the consumer end of the spectrum. And it says, well, as I said before, to me, it's a bit, the analogy is a bit like, car manufacturers, we can force the car manufacturers to have seat belts, but at the end of the day, if the drivers don't, the users don't put the seat belt on, don't fasten the seatbelt, then that's not going to do much good. And there are things that are more passive, like airbag, they will work no matter what the user does. And so SLSA does some of this, but to get the full benefit, we depend on the consumer to do certain things. And this is what this section does. So in that aspect, I think we definitely want to say, these are the things you must do.
So I guess my concern about saying must here is like, if someone doesn't do it, what is the impact? Right, like if on the build system requirements page, if you don't isolate between builds or you don't generate provenance or something like that, then you would not be allowed to say you are SLSA build level X compliant, conformant, or whatever the word is. But if verification doesn't happening or you skip whatever step that we had called mandatory, what is it that you do not get to say is conformant?
Well, I think the user, in their practices are not going to be able to claim they are compliant, and therefore there are certain benefits that would come from being compliant that they cannot claim to have. And if, they may not be the last in the chain, right? So it translates to anybody who's beyond this.
I guess a challenge I have is that if this were a requirement for calling something a build level, then I would get it. It's like that is a requirement of level 3. But I think where we've gone the past couple weeks or month or whatever is splitting that out. So the build level is satisfied if you just generate provenance. And then the verification of that is a kind of a separate thing. But we don't have like a name for that, maybe?
Yes, that I agree. We don't, but to me, verifying artifacts define what the consumer must do to take advantage of the build level provided by the build systems. And yeah,
Right.
you're right, we don't have a name for it, but
I think so. That's the thing. As a verification page itself, I want to be less specific. But if we're referencing verification on the level requirements, I think we can then say you must do something. To your point, for certain levels, for certain pieces, we can say, and you must do verification of X or of all the things. And that would make perfect sense to me, dictating that on the levels. If we don't, how can anyone say that they are reaching that? Whereas on the level page, we should just be more generic and say, this is what this means. And for certain levels, you will have to do certain parts of this at different points in the process.
Would what are thoughts on taking this verifying artifacts page, which again for reference for is this page, the verifying artifacts, and for at least 1.0, we call them guidelines or recommendations, and avoid saying anything is required or must. Let's say like you should do this, and these are recommendations, which would avoid the problem of like, if you don't do it, then are you SLSA compliant or not, because it wasn't a requirement in the first place. But would still give us the opportunity in a future version to like turn that into give it a name and add requirements. Any feelings, positive or negative, about that? And would it actually resolve the underlying issue?
Yes, I mean, basically you're shrinking further the scope of the spec. So of course it kind of removes some of the roadblocks we have by saying, okay, let's put those things aside. And it's not unreasonable. So, but then basically what you're saying is we are specifically making SLSA 1.0 about build systems and for build implementers. The consumer side is not directly addressed.
I agree. I agree that we don't address currently the consumer side in the sense that if you want to have some sense of security from a LP package, we need to address locally as a user the transitiveness. You need to address the source track. So I think we are still in the infant side for all that verification part, because we will need the other tracks, I think, to give something really useful for the end user. I'm not sure I'm very clear about what I'm saying, but that's my feeling. So that's why I would keep guidelines for now, and I agree with Mark on that. And see, once we have the other tracks and how to see for end user consumer, how to give a sense of security when you use something and define it. And these things will appear by themselves when we develop tools around all this probably. And so I think we need to be patient on that one.
Trying to think through like what because I agree. I just think that also like when I think purely about the SLSA provenance aspect of it, I've always considered it purely about provenance. It's making no assertions about, like, did it come from the right place? Just that this is the place I got it from, right? The build system is making this claim, hey, I got it from this place. If it has resolved dependencies, it's telling you I downloaded these dependencies and these are the hashes. And so the idea was always, at least from my, if I think about it from like a end user perspective, and the way I was using it when I was an end user, we were always looking at it not necessarily as a way to sort of prove that necessarily anything was good. It was just enough information that when you were verifying, like for audit purposes or anything, you could always go back and say, hey, something went wrong. Well, let's look at the SLSA provenance and see, did it pull from the right place, and so on. And I think those are the sorts of pieces of information that we were looking at when we were verifying against SLSA v0.1. Like, it wasn't necessarily, that any given piece was good. It was just that the provenance gave you confidence that the build system wasn't lying to you.
If we're going to remove verifying provenance from, like, if we're going to make that a recommendation, we should probably do similar with the distributing provenance page as well, I think. Or should we, I guess? Okay, question.
Yeah, probably. To clarify the hypothetical that talking about on the verifying artifacts page, it would be to, I mean, keep the same content, possibly with the outstanding pull requests, but just avoid the word must. Basically, every case of must would change into should. So monitor should, expectation should be sufficient, etc. As Nicola said, I think, maybe we would turn that into a future track or something like that with more specificity. One thing I'll note is that right now the text currently says the phrase, it defines a SLSA conformant system, but we never actually say, I think, what that is. I think that kind of introduces a new concept unintentionally, or like there's kind of been maybe implicitly some sort of notion, but I don't know if we've ever really discussed or agreed explicitly about what that means. So yeah, it would be basically kind of giving up the idea of calling a requirement here and punting it to the next revision.
Go ahead, Anna.
No, go ahead. You're first.
I was going to say, I think like the focus on build systems has been fairly consistent and implicit through the 1.0 effort. So I don't feel like we're making a significant kind of reduction in scope. We're just acknowledging the existing scope because we've talked a lot about how there's a chicken and egg problem, and that you need build systems to be producing the provenance metadata before you can have a good feel for how to integrate that into different ecosystems and things. And we've been trying to provide incremental like tooling and things, and we haven't got as far with verification. Well, that's not fair. The SLSA verify is very nice, but the provenance distribution and integrating the verification into kind of client workflows hasn't been particularly well tested because we don't have a large number of systems producing the metadata yet. So I just wanted to kind of state that observation.
So again, I don't disagree with the general proposal of, shrinking down the scope to just build systems and making SLSA mostly about, build system implementers and defining what it means to be conformant to SLSA from that point of view. But back to and in line with what you just showed, Mark, what does it mean for a system in general to be SLSA compliant? I mean, you can imagine I'm selling some kind of device. It's a piece of hardware and it's got to, have some software on it. And I could claim compliance with SLSA if I said, I checked I verify the provenance of all the software that I actually put on my device. And I may never have developed anything myself, but I'm on the receiving end of software, and I make sure I'm verifying all this stuff so you don't end up in your device with some crap. So that would be a use case for what it means to be compliant as a consumer of the SLSA provenance. And I'm telling my consumers, my users, that I have done all the verification so that they can have confidence in the product.
I can't tell. Are you recommending downgrading like the must to should, or?
No, this is independent. I was just trying to, clarify what I meant earlier by, trying to define what it means to have some kind of, and maybe you're right, it should have a name, a different kind of track, to say what it means to be SLSA compliant from a consumer side point of view. But so I didn't mean to, and when I said must earlier, I didn't mean to get into the detail. There may be cases where there are shoulds. That doesn't mean everything becomes a must, but it's more in terms of, what are the requirements to be compliant with SLSA from a consumer point of view, rather than from a build system implementer or provider.
Yeah, I mean, I want this to be part of the specification. What I'm not sure about is whether what we have right now is like, basically, like what do we call 1.0? I don't want to push out the date. I'd rather, if something is incomplete, kind of note it as such and then wait for a future release. I guess maybe it would help to know, like, if someone could take the other side of, like, I think we've had several people mention of, like, they don't disagree with that idea, but if there's any thoughts on, like, an argument for keeping it as is, that would also be helpful too, just so we can kind of see how.
But there is nothing wrong with having consensus. If we all happen to agree, then don't.
Well, I mean, some folks might be quiet or not speak up, or, like, there's a bias, I think, of, like, oh, I don't want to disagree, or I'm not
Fair
super
enough.
confident, so I don't want to speak up. So I just want to raise the possibility. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I just think when I think of, like, verification, right, it immediately makes me think of what are the attacks I'm trying to prevent? Like, when looking at this sort of thing, what is the goal of me to try and figure out, like, hey, I want to use this SLSA compliant artifact, and I want to verify certain elements of it in order for me to achieve some goal. I'm not just doing it for my own health or whatever. So when I think about, like, once again, some of these things, and like, I think it's worthwhile just, and I don't know if anybody has these other use cases. Like, my use case was always like, I can show you that if something went wrong, it's probably not the build system, right? That was kind of one of the key things that I was taking, like, as a takeaway from SLSA was, let me look at source, let me look at dependencies, because those might have been an issue, but the build system, if I look at it and it seems to have listed all the right things, and it's also compliant, then I'm pretty sure it performed those actions, and let me look at the dependencies or the source as the place of the problem. And I think maybe just kind of, like, thinking through some of those things might help out with understanding what we should be verifying.
I guess I'll jump in here. I think, Mark, I've been listening a little bit, and I mean, I think the goal, when I used to do this back in the day, I just think about, I just want to know. I don't even want to, like, I don't even want to take any action. I just want to know what's out there. What do we have? How are we being protective, or what is like just exposed? So I think if we go with that mindset, like, I'll call it a soft governance of just letting people know, letting people be aware, and then just releasing, iteratively releasing. We're not going to get it right the first time. So let's just go ahead and move forward, and then we'll adjust as we go. I mean, we're just trying to educate everybody out in the world that, hey guys, are you just aware? Are you aware from a soft governance perspective? And hey guys, if you're not aware, hey, you should maybe try these tools that we recommend. Well, the guac, the macaroons, the in toto, the blah blah blah, right? And then hey, here's an example of what we would do. I don't know. I just I've seen this work in the past, and just making suggestions. But I think we should just do it. Let's just deploy out there. We have nothing to lose. But people giving us comments and telling us no, that you guys are wrong, or you guys, yeah, you guys are great. You guys did a great job.
So I thoroughly enjoy showing up to meetings like this with that naive understanding and asking questions from from a novice viewpoint. I'm curious how the specification defining the SLSA levels doesn't make the verification implicit. Like, why does there need to be like this like contrary or other half of the side for the way in which the levels are defined, that there's any like any ability to have an interpretation of whether or not something is verified? So maybe that would just be helpful for me in understanding.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's almost two halves of this. One is actually, maybe I'll present like just so we have a visual aid. Verify artifacts. There's currently a pull request that unifies these things, but I'll use. We have that picture. Oh, no, we have the picture right here. That like what we currently define as the build level just covers these threats here of basically the build level just covers, is the provenance trustworthy? Like, it claims it came from this source. How confident are we that it actually came from this source and someone wasn't lying to us? But we also want to cover things like, did it come from the expected source repo? Or like, did you build from an unofficial fork? Did you have local modifications in your Git client and you built from that and not the actual thing that was checked in and everyone had code reviewed? And that's not currently covered by the build level. It was suggested last week, I think, or maybe in a previous meeting at least, maybe that should just be a future source track, like cover A, B, and C in this diagram as a source track. And then I think that would actually make it a lot cleaner. And then maybe it would really become more obvious of like verifying it as more straightforward. But right now, I think we're in the situation where we have the build level plus some other things to do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the only thing I was going to sort of add in there, just once again, like from like the perspective of, hey, consuming, like we always viewed SLSA, the build piece, if source or dependencies are included, they're not necessarily saying that the source and dependencies are valid source and dependencies, just that the builder built these source and dependencies, and it's up to you then to go back and figure out yada yada as you go through. If we were to create a source step in the future, then you can say, okay, well, if it's a SLSA, SLSA compliant to the source step and SLSA compliant to the build step, then you are pretty sure that the source and the build are both safe for some level of safe.
Can you hear me?
I think this is next.
Okay. It goes back to the old problem. What is provenance? Provenance, in the opinion of some people, is that this is what happened. This is a builder that built from this source code. It doesn't say that the source is good, that the program is benign. It just says that it was built from this source code and with a build system that can address certain threats. And so that means that it solves half of the problem. The other half is what should have been built from, and that's not what the provenance says. Something else says should be built from a particular source. And so we have these two halves. It would be nice if provenance could say, this program is good, but provenance cannot say that. It can only say, I built a piece of software from a particular source with particular dependency instances. And so, or looks like with verification and build provenance, we're still not certain about the boundaries between the two.
Nicole?
I wish I put things in order. I think everyone keeps saying there's two sides. I think there's possibly three or more, because earlier we mentioned consumers verifying stuff. So I think there's the consumers verifying stuff, the build provenance, the source, whatever we want to call the source step. So I feel like, I'm not sure who said it earlier, but like keeping the version 1.0 focused in on the build makes the most sense to me, with the expectation that we start working towards having more clear source and consumer depths or guidelines iteratively going forward.
Sounds good. So it sounds like the consensus is to make that change. I could send out a pull request that just swaps the words. And I think whoever mentioned it, maybe Josh said this, we should probably do the same thing for the distributing provenance too, because it's probably in the same boat. Okay, so I will do that. I could also comment on the issue to say that we discussed it at today's meeting. I think in the interest of time, we should move on. In terms of the mechanics of doing the release today, I guess there's nothing hard that it has to be today. Although if we need 2 weeks and we want to release on the 19th, then we'll have to do it today or tomorrow. We have a couple outstanding pull requests. We should get those merged. This one will be a pull request that'll have to get merged too, and then a pull request to actually do the thing. Is there enough time in the day? Are we okay having folks, whoever, most probably US based folks, I'm guessing, because most people in Europe or Asia are going to be asleep. Just doing that today? I mean, normally we want pull requests like longer time to comment.
If we can afford to have one more day, I think we should do that. That way everybody has a chance to see it before we actually publish this new policy. You can do the pull request. You can even merge it if there's at least another person or two.
But just merge it basically tomorrow morning.
But not release the version yet, so that some of us who are in Europe have a chance to look at it and say, yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Any disagreement? Okay, that sounds good to me. And then the blog, we need to also do a mailing list announcement because that's listed in our governance docs. I think it could just be a copy of the blog post. The blog post, is anyone here involved in that?
One of my coworkers, I believe, is.
Because we need to also coordinate on that and do it at the same time as well.
Yeah, but it depends which blog post you're talking about. Because so BICAD, the one that we reviewed, there's a pull request. That's just on the SLSA dev website, right? That I think we should just publish it already.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. It's going. I'm gonna click after this meeting. I'll click merge.
Okay. Then
So
I
meant
think
that
what you're talking
announcing
about,
release
Mark,
candidate too.
is the bigger
Yeah.
one, right?
Yeah, so there's two separate things. One is the release candidate 2, which, yeah, I think, I don't know if we have anything specifically set up for that. I'm sure we could probably draft something up real quick based on release candidate 1, just being like replace with the release candidate 2. And then further, we're still kind of working on the 1.0 stuff. I believe that there is some of the folks from the OpenSSF side still have some of the v0.1 info, so there's some stuff there that still says like, oh, we're glad to announce the 4 levels of salsa, and so we're editing some of that.
Okay, I'll post on Slack to see if anyone has already had an RC2. I know there's also like a full 1.0 post that's announcement that's being drafted, but specifically just a short one about RC2 saying, you know, the second release candidate, the review period is this. We, you know, barring any unforeseen changes, we plan to accept it, or vote to accept, or whatever is the proper language, on the 19th, etc. Nicola?
Adjusting the graph, and there is a typo in the graph, just to, in the D, there is an N missing in dependencies.
Where?
Just minor, but it's in front of me or just right now. In the graph you are sharing.
Inside the green square that says dependencies, it's dependencies is spelled wrong. Yeah.
It's just popping right now. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that image needs to be fixed. All right, thanks. I'll create a note of that. Thanks.
So if I'm recapping correctly, the goal is that by today, as many of the PRs as possible get closed so that Europe can make any comments in the morning, and then the directory copy happens along with a blog post, which it sounds like there may or may not be an RC2 one ready already. And if there's not, we're going to copy the RC1 blog post. That sound accurate?
Yep. Okay, I actually have to head out early. But if someone else could continue running the meeting, that would be good. One thing that would, I think, be helpful to maybe briefly talk about, but like what changes are okay during the review period. I think we talked about editorial changes. I just want to make sure we're on the same page and that we have agreement on that concept. Could someone volunteer just to facilitate the rest?
Okay.
Thanks.
But so, I mean, yeah, specifically about this point, I think it's, you know, it's pretty clear. It's not a maybe it's easier to define Paima. It's easier to say what it's not, right? If it's not editorial, if the change impacts the compliance of an implementation, right? So I have an implementation, I implemented against the draft, and now I need to go change my code because we have updated the spec, then that's not editorial. Formally, that's what it's about. Now, of course, in reality, sometimes it's a bit of a gray area because it's like, you know, you could imagine that the text is just ambiguous and two different readers might have two different interpretations. And by just changing it, we mean it to be just a clarification, but it rolls out one implementation. And then it's, there's, you know, we're going to have an impact. And even though we meant it to be just editorial, for somebody, it's not going to be. And this is much harder to judge, but at least, you know, so it's not bulletproof. As soon as you change stuff, unless, you know, it's just commas and typos, there's always the risk that it's not just editorial, but at least we should be aware when we make changes and think about, you know, do we expect this to change? So for instance, if you think there are cases where it's very simple, like if you look at the provenance format, if you change the name of an property, well, that's it. You know, this is not going to be just editorial. If you change the description of that property, then, you know, is it editorial or not? It's going to depend on the nature of the changes. So that's basically, you know, my years of standards development have taught me. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything, or if there's any disagreement. But so, Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, based on some of the comments about this sort of like over the past couple of weeks, I think I've just been trying to see, you know, since we're not the first folks to write up a specification or standard or framework around this sort of thing, you know, I think that there's a lot of useful information about how generally folks handle it. And yeah, it's like, yep, that's why there's so many, you know, you see like for like NIST documents, you see like Rev 5, Rev 6, and a lot of times it's not necessarily even just like any real content changes. It's like a clarification because, hey, a clarification, two people are going in opposite directions, and even a clarification is like, well, you're now saying that the way I was doing it originally was completely invalid, which is not the, you know, expectation. And so, yeah, we just got to be careful. And I do think that, you know, there's a lot of useful history out there that we can, you know, look to follow to make sure that we're doing it the right way.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you know, I think it's easier in some cases, like I was saying, for formats. And if you can have like tests, you know, if we had tests, it's easier to find out. Here, the problem with SLSA is some of it is not, you know, hard coded, and it's not like there's still, you know, I think it's been said before, SLSA has its roots in something that's more aspirational, and then it becomes a bit harder to test and to have hard set rules. And so I think SLSA has evolved towards something that's much more prescriptive, but it's still, you know, in some areas can be a bit more challenging to figure it out. So that's how it is. But I think that basically sets the rules for what we can allow ourselves to change after we have published RC2, before we publish the final version, with that doing another RC, which would be RC3. Because I mean, it's not the end of the game, right? It just means that if we make changes that don't qualify as editorial, if we can, you know, if we're convinced of that, then we have to do an RC3 and have another 2-week period before we publish the final. So that's the rules. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up, either about this or something else? If not,
Mike, you've got a topic on the agenda.
Oh yeah, I mean, it can wait till next time. I think one of the things, and this is kind of more of a post 1.0 thing, one of the things that folks have been bringing up about conformance and some of the other things is, it's great that we're looking at, like, you know, you should have a document somewhere and yada yada, but some folks are saying, like, how can I distribute that information in sort of also a programmatic and automated way? So stuff like, could, you know, is it in the cards to have something like a SLSA conformance attestation that could have as this, like, you know, here is the conformance document location or something like that, and here's a bunch of other information, so that folks who are coming through, you know, they're like, oh, this thing claims that it was built with this SLSA builder. I don't necessarily need to check right this second that it is in fact SLSA conformant and have somebody review the document, but when I pull this in, I want to pull down that attestation. Was it signed by somebody I trust or whatever? Did some other third party that I do trust certify it or whatever? And then when I go back, you know, I can go and out of band read through the human readable documentation and go through that sort of thing. I think that's just, you know, yeah. Anyway, Josh.
Yeah, so we definitely did talk. I think Chris, who's on the call, and I spoke at least briefly about having like an attestation, an in-total attestation that says, you know, someone has reviewed this build service for conformance with the build requirements, and you know, is providing an attestation that they performed that review. We spoke about it, if I'm remembering correctly, in the context of the conformance program, which is a post 1.0 activity. So I expect it will come back up then. So yeah, I think this is something we likely will end up doing effectively. And just figuring out how to distribute those and how they fit into the verification cycle and everything is something we'll need to figure out. Chris, sorry.
Okay.
I was just going to invite Chris to comment because he's been closer to the conformance discussion.
Chris, are you with us?
He's having
Oh, he said
audio
he's-
issues.
yeah.
Yeah, well, so go ahead, Arno, if you had something to add.
You know, so I was going to say, so in the conformance, I mean, you know, for now, the people who've been working in the conformance program, they are looking at the CNCF one, and the CNCF has basically a website, and there's a repository. This is how they register their claims of compliance, and so I think this shouldn't be hard to, you know, that would be the place to have that if we want to have a repository of attestations of claim of compliance. But yeah, basically what you're saying is that we should have this as a requirement for the conformance program to say, hey, we want to have machine readable attestations. All right, we are basically out of time. So, oh, I see Chris posted something in the chat. Yeah. So I guess it's all right. We are out of time anyway. So we'll close on this and we can discuss this further next time when we talk about the conference program in more details. For those who are interested, there is a thread and there are a couple of people who've been working on it. There's a draft being worked on. You should be able to get the pointers in from the Slack channel if you need. All right, with that being said, right on time, so I will leave it at this. Thank you all. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.